It is so good to see you this Thursday morning. We are in our Digging Deeper episodes and we're looking at Leviticus. This is episode, goodness me, I've forgotten, we've done so many, I don't know. This is episode 10, I think, and I hope you're enjoying it so far. We have covered a lot of ground, still got some ground to go. And this is the book that everyone loves to hate. And today we are going to focus on 3 chapters that our culture would loathe if our culture was kind of even remotely well versed in what the Bible says rather than just assuming what it says. These 3 chapters of the Bible would not be appreciated, but I think they're some of the most beautiful, some of the most compelling, some of the most illuminating, and even I think I'd say progressive, especially given the time that they were written in. But even for us, so just studying chapters 18 to 20 in Leviticus has made me think we don't need to move. We've not moved beyond Leviticus. In fact, I think we need to move beyond where we are now as a society to something closer to a kind of Levitical vision of what society could be like. So just a recap as to where we've been. Firstly, make sure you got your coffee, make sure you got your notepad, your Bible, whatever else you usually use for these things. You're committed. If you've watched this far, you are committed, you've done well. And just as a reminder that I'm just going to say until I'm blue in the face, because otherwise I think Leviticus just makes no sense. This is about God teaching a new people how to be human. He's rescued the Israelites out of a society ordered around all sorts of kinds of gods. And he's brought them he's going to bring them into a new place, I should say, at the point where Leviticus is spoken, where they order their society around him, the God of freedom, the God that needs no one, which is kind of what his name, like when you see Lord all in capitals, that's his name, Yahweh, which kind of means, he says it in Exodus 3, I am who I am, kind of like, I exist because I exist. You can't go any deeper than the existence of God. He doesn't rely on no one. He needs no one. It's kind of what his name means. But he also chooses to identify himself with these slaves, rescues them, starts to form this kind of new humanity, teaching them to what it means to be truly human, based around this tent in their camp, which is like a world in miniature. It's like a kind of microcosm, a small version of what God wants to do everywhere. And what that means is that everything that happens to this people and everything that happens to this space, this tent and the camp at large, is actually about every person everywhere. Okay, this is like humanity 101 going on here. This is ground zero of what is happening and what God wants to do throughout the whole world. And a couple of weeks ago, we hit the high point of Leviticus, which commentators argue is also the high point of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through to Deuteronomy. And it's Leviticus 16, Yom Kippur, you might have heard that phrase, the Day of Atonement. I think better maybe put the Day of Coverings, where basically God says, for all the rituals, for all the regulations, for all the restrictions, for all the rhythms, the center of what it means to order society and order your life around the God of freedom is that you stand there and do nothing while God takes away your junk. And we saw that with the 2 goats. There was one goat that got killed, a sacrifice to the Lord, another goat that left the camp. This is a beautiful moment. And everything from Leviticus 16, everything up to Leviticus 16 is leading to it, and everything from Leviticus 16 is flowing from it. So now every time the reason I said that the last week as well, is because every time we read a commandment or something to do with ethics, we've got to read it as flowing from a place of you're not doing things to create a relationship with this God. You're doing it because he's created a relationship with you. The way that you live flows out of what he's done. What you do flows out of what he has done. And we talked about last week about the 2 words imperative and indicative. Indicative is what God has done for you regardless of you. And imperative is what you do off the back of that. The way that you live always flows from this rhythm of grace of once a year God removes your junk and your stains. So that's what's going on. And in the Holiness Code, chapters 17 through 27, we've kind of got an outworking of the ritual. So we've got these rituals in chapters 1 to 16 that culminates in the Day of Covering, which God does everything, we do nothing. And then chapters 17 through 27 are kind of the outworking. You can never get one without the other. Okay, if you go ritual but don't go, what does this mean for us as a society? You've not really understood and embodied the ritual. And if you go, let's just be ethical, and forget that, you actually don't. You end up with just something meaningless. This isn't about ethics. Some people think there's ritual and ethics, two separate things. This is about living out the ritual. This is about embodying the ritual. This is about embodying, the one commentator puts it, body forthing this God into the world. So you align your heart through the ritual. You align yourself and the community to this God through the ritual, then to go and live it out in the world. So it's this kind of, I think, beautiful rhythm of these things. And last week we looked at chapter 17, which is the kind of the sacredness of life, both animal and human. And we're going to see a bit more of that this week in chapters 18 to 20. Okay, we touched on this last week, but we're going to dive straight back in. It's a kind of mini section in of itself. 18 is a chapter all about sex and child sacrifice, largely. 19 is the kind of the center, if you like, of this half of the book, the high point of this half of the book, if you like. It's about being like God and loving one another. And then chapter 20 is a chapter about sex, largely, and about child sacrifice. So you've got this strange sandwich where the center, the importance, is around us being like this God. But then very closely linked to that is what we do with our sex lives and what we sacrifice to. And bound up in chapter 19 as well, is a load of kind of ways of treating the poor, the vulnerable, the foreigner, etc. So that's where we are. So if you've got a Bible, turn to chapter Leviticus 18, 19 and 20. So a kind of little overview again of these section. That's the kind of overview, a little kind of just helpful things before we dig in. So 19 is kind of the center of this unit, and 19:2 says this famous phrase, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, Yahweh, that name, your God, am holy. So the God who revealed himself as the Lord in the Exodus, so the God who needs no one but identifies with the oppressed, who comes to the aid of slaves, the God of freedom, we might say, is looking to bring freedom to the world through his people. So when you read the phrase, which is repeated often in this section, be holy because I am holy, I the Lord am holy, you're not just getting be ethical because I'm ethical, be good because I'm good. You're getting, no, pattern yourself after me. I'm the God who identifies with the oppressed. I'm the God of freedom. Be like me. Enter into my freedom. Become free as I am free, in that sense. It's a really important phrase. And at the heart of chapter 19, which is all about being like God, okay, it's really important to remember that being like God is the kind of central theme here. At the middle of that chapter is a very famous verse in verse 18, which Jesus picks up on, which says, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. Right? I'm the God of freedom. Right? Always remember that with that name. So at the centre of the chapter about being like God is loving your neighbour as you would want them to love you. And Jesus expounds on that, right? He says, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. I'm telling you, love your enemy. So Jesus is saying, you want to know what God's like? You want to be like God in Leviticus 19 language? Love your enemy. What does that tell you about the God of freedom? It tells you that he's a God who loves his enemies. And we're to be like him. We're to pattern ourselves after him. And all of this flows from this rhythm of chapter 16 of grace, that we've received the grace of God, and therefore we become channels of it. So loving others is at the heart of what it looks like to reorder society around the God of freedom. So when Leviticus 19:2 says we should be like God, the peak of that section is loving people who aren't like you. Which is why when people use, so we'll come across verses in both chapter 18 and chapter 20 about all sorts of sexual practices, but homosexuality is one that's kind of which we culturally we accept. Okay, like in our culture at large we accept. Much of the sexual prohibitions in this section we still don't. But homosexuality, sex between two men or two women is culturally acceptable. So we've got to be careful here. We've got to be wise. And people have used these verses in awful ways. And often some people know them as the clobber passages, which basically means the verses of the Bible that you get out when you want to beat someone over the head who is gay, who got same-sex orientation. And we must never use the Bible like that. And the reason we must never use it is not just because, that's not very kind or not very tolerant or not very nice. It's because the Bible doesn't permit us to use it like that. Because in the centre of this section is love your neighbour as you would want to be loved by them. Treat them as you would want to be treated by them. Which if it means nothing else, it means that you absolutely cannot rip a verse out of its context and go and hit someone over the head with it. You absolutely cannot do that. And it just cuts against, when you hear people do that, professing Christians, when they do that, they've removed themselves so far from this God, the God of freedom. We'll come to what we should think about homosexuality and other things a bit later, but that's just a precursor to say, is a must to say, we must use the Bible for its own intent and with its own tone, never out of context of what this God is saying and who this God is. And it's just interesting that a section that's primarily about being like the God of freedom involves a shed load of material about what we do with our sex lives. There's something intrinsically linked between the God that we worship and what we do with our bodies. So, are we ready? Chapter 18. I mean, you are just going to absolutely love this. I just can tell, just through the lens, how much you are going to love this. Okay, we're just going to read some verses and then I'll comment as we go. So verse 2 of chapter 18, speak to the people of Israel. So remember we looked at that last week, that shift. It's not just speak to Aaron and his sons anymore, just speak to the priests. God says to Moses, speak to all the people, right? This is for all the people. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, what's the first thing that you should say to all the people? I am the Lord your God. I mean, man, it's like a broken record, isn't it? But it's this beautiful rhythm underneath the whole passage. I'm the Lord. I'm the God who needs no one but identifies with the oppressed. I'm the God who rescued you from slavery. I'm the God who did everything. I'm the God of freedom. Always remember, the first thing that you should tell the people before you start with what they do with their sex lives is, I'm the God of freedom. I'm the God of freedom. I'm the God of freedom. It's just bang, 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 like this cadence, like this rhythm, like this beat throughout the whole thing. And we must never forget, we must never remove that, kind of lose sight of that, otherwise we'll just lose sight of the whole thing. Verses 3 and 4, you shall not do as they did in the land of Egypt, where you lived, where you've come from, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. So you've come out of one place, Egypt, you're going into another place, Canaan, and the propensity is, the danger is that it's so easy to become like the neighbours. I mean, you'll know this if you're a follower of Jesus. It's so easy to wed ourselves to the cultural values of the day. It's so easy to become like our culture, especially now with things like social media and all the stuff that we're fed and bombarded with. We have no idea. We have no idea how much we're being influenced by our culture. And that's why we've got to study Leviticus. That's why we've got to get ourselves into the world of the Bible. It's because it helps us. It helps ground us. It helps form and shape our worldview. And C.S. Lewis has this great quote where he says, a man thinks because of his dealings with money, he's talking about money here, a man thinks because of his dealings with money that he's finding his place in the world. But what he doesn't realise is that through his dealings with money, the world is finding its place in him. That's a fascinating phrase. It's to do with money, but he's saying without realising it, we think we're just finding our place in the world, but what's actually happening is the world is finding its place in us. And Paul in Romans 12 verse 2 says, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world. Don't allow the world to find its place in you. Rather be transformed by the renewing of our minds. It's so easy to become like the neighbours, but we mustn't. We must love the neighbours. We must enter into our culture, actually. We must take the gospel into our culture, but we must be, even though we seek to look like our culture in many ways, like Jesus took on flesh, like Paul says, I became all things to all people so that by any means I might save some. The people of Israel were coming out of one culture and actually going into another, but God says don't become like them. Keep yourself distinct, keep your distinctness. And then, are you ready for this? Verses 6 through, I don't know, we'll see how far. We'll just read some and we'll see when we get sick of it. None of you shall approach one of his close relatives to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. Uncovered nakedness is a euphemism for sex, okay? So I am the Lord, remember, always, it's kind of always there. Verse 7, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother, right? Did he even need to write that? She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. So don't have sex with your mum. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It's your father's nakedness. So stepmom, I guess. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. So don't have sex with your sister, don't have sex with your stepsister, I guess, half-sister, something like that. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter, right, so your granddaughter, or your daughter's daughter, your granddaughter, for this is all talking in the masculine, by the way, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. Notice the kind of argument. It's not just don't have sex with your granddaughter because that's wrong. That is wrong, and that is what this is saying, and cuts against the grain of the God of freedom. So something slavish about that. But it's also because you're defiling yourself, right? Because you in the ancient world, you live through your ancestors. So anything that you do you live through your descendants. So anything that you do kind of to undermine the stability and flourishing of your descendants, you're actually doing to yourself, which is why it says that she's your own nakedness, right? If you have sex with your granddaughter, you're doing something not just against her, but against you, and you should take note of that. Verse 11, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, brought up in your father's family, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister, she is your father's relative. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's relative. She's your aunt. Do we need to say this, okay? You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother, that is, you shall not approach his wife, she is your aunt. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law, she is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife, it is your brother's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and of her daughter. You shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are relatives, it is depravity. You shall not take a woman as a rival wife to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is alive. Whew. I mean, we could just keep going, but we're not going to. So much to say about this that we're not going to be able to say too much. But this is primarily concerned, I think, with the family unit. Okay, you can see that. So don't have sex with your father's wife, your mother's daughter, your mother's son, your father's daughter, your mother's sister. It's all talking about the family unit, the integrity and the stability of the family unit. And it's either talking about things that break up the family unit, so that's something like, that damage the family unit, I should say. That's something like incest or adultery. So something that's going to break. You have sex with another man's wife, and that breaks up your marriage. You have sex with your sister and it breaks in some way, it fragments, it distorts the integrity of the family unit, or things that don't cause the family unit to flourish or extend it. So I don't think we actually came onto it, did we? Verse 19, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she's in her menstrual uncleanness, so while she's on her period. You shall not lie sexually with your neighbour's wife and so make yourself unclean with her. Sorry, I didn't read this bit. You shall not give any of your children or offer them to Molech and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. We'll come back to that. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not lie with any animal and so make yourself unclean with it. Neither shall any woman give herself to an animal to lie with it. It is a perversion. So you've got things that break the family unit in some way, and then you've got things that don't extend the family unit. So like having sex with an animal, having sex with someone of the same sex, because there's, well, for loads of reasons, we're going to look at some in a minute, but there's no procreation possible there. So I think the primary concern of this passage is family, which is really important to note. It's not just, let me just tell you all the sexual things you can't do. I think the primary concern is the integrity and health of the family unit. And the first command to a human family was to multiply and fill the earth and subdue it in Genesis 1 verse 28. And then God said to Abraham, or Abram as it was then, that it was through his family that all the world would be blessed and rescued. And family reflects God because of its mutual care of one another and its self-sacrifice and the community it has within itself, right? So that it just reflects God, because God is a family in that sense. God is a community between Father, Son and Spirit, kind of mutually deferring to one another, sacrificing on behalf of the others, this kind of mutual joy and community that's going on. And families also reproduce themselves. That's the kind of mark of a healthy family in that sense. So it's almost like sex and then procreation from it is actually the closest we get to being like God. Okay, the closest moment you get to being with God is in the moment of sex, actually, to not to be crude in any way, but in the moment of climax and then the moment of conception. When that happens, there's no closer you can get to being like God. When it says be holy because I am holy, be like me, the sex moment is as close as you're ever going to get to being like God, which tells us why a chapter around how to order society, how to worship God and how to be like God is so interlinked with family and sex. It's worth just saying that as we've become less and less of a Christian nation, so I don't mean by that everyone by any means was Christians, but we've less and less adopting the values of Christianity, the value of the family, I think, has decreased, which is shown in like divorce figures, the amount of single parents, the amount of children growing up without fathers who haven't taken responsibility for their actions, the level of abortion, which we'll come back to. So is it that we've moved away from Christian values and therefore the value of the family has diminished? Or is it, as some social psychologists argue, that the role of the family has diminished and therefore as a society we've moved increasingly away from Christian values? And what they're saying is that the family is the place where a faith in God and an ordering of life, starting with the individual, the family, and then extending to the wider society, that happens in family life. So if families break down because of these kind of things and others, or they don't extend, then actually the faith of the community at large and the reordering of society around the God of freedom is kind of set back and diluted. So it's just worth kind of bearing some of that stuff in mind. Verse 21, let's just focus a sec there about Molech. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. The rhythm, the beat. Remember the rhythm and the beat. Molech was a god of the Canaanites. He was a god who he lingers over the edges of the Old Testament, kind of occasionally rearing his head and showing his face. And he's known for requiring child sacrifice to appease him. So not just a sacrifice of your grain, not just a sacrifice of your newborn calf, say, but a sacrifice of your son or your daughter that you'd burn in the fire. Often talks about that in the Old Testament, to keep him happy. So he was a god of the neighbours, right? He was a god. Israel are coming into Canaan, and Molech is one of the gods that the Canaanites worship. And one of the reasons that God gives for bringing his people into Canaan is to drive out. Like the people of Israel are like the instrument of the justice of God to drive out a people from the land who he hates their practices. And that's kind of epitomized, if you like, in this worship of Molech. And we've talked a lot about sacrifice and stuff, but like, just to recap briefly, the ancients had a god for everything: fertility, war, harvest, the sea, the land, the geographical region, the hills. And so the ancients would offer sacrifices to those gods to get that god on your side and to get them to line up with you and to make them favourable, which is all goes well when the thing that you want to go well, right? If you offer a sacrifice of a calf so that your breeding goes well this year and you get a good kind of I don't even know what the word is, like a good amount of newborn calves. So you think, I'll sacrifice this calf so that the god of I don't know, the animals, the god of wildlife, I don't know, the god of farming, the god of whatever, the livestock, will give me 100 calves in this season's produce, say. So you kill the calf, you get your 100, maybe you get your 120, and you think the god was pleased by that they were moved into action by that. That satisfied them. But what happens when you only get 30 calves, not 100? What happens when the disease hits and half your livestock is wiped out? What does that tell you about that god? Well, it tells you that you didn't offer him enough. And so you offer more. You offer 2 calves, you offer 10 calves. Maybe you think calves aren't enough. The calf isn't valuable enough. What else have I got around here to offer the god to appease it? And it's almost like a natural thought process. I mean, so unnatural in many ways, and we're horrified by the thought, but you think, what have I got more to offer? And it's all very well saying, what, you sacrifice your son over the kind of, your livestock. I mean, it was mental. But if you think that maybe you've got 10 children, and maybe your children next year may well not eat and therefore will die because there's no welfare state. If I don't get the crop we need to make enough money, my children will starve. Then maybe you do start to think maybe it is better to sacrifice one for the good of the other 9. Maybe you're feeding the community, your village, with your produce, your harvest from your field. You think, okay, well, this is awful. Then it's not like they would be bound up with the same emotion around it as you would. But when a whole village, when 20 families' children are relying on it, what do you think then? Where do you go then? What do you do then? I think it's a little more complex than we might like to think. But it does sound primitive to us, doesn't it? But I think it's worth noting at this moment a few things. The sacrifice of children in the ancient world was commonplace. It was commonplace, so that the culture that Leviticus is spoken into, the culture that this God of freedom wants to kind of uproot so that they can build a new way of ordering society around him, child sacrifice was commonplace in that culture. You can tell that in Genesis 22 because Abraham, when God says to him, sacrifice your son Isaac, in whom is bound all of the promises God has ever made to Abraham, are kind of embodied in Isaac. So it's way more for Abraham than just sacrifice your son, as horrendous as that would be. It's like everything that you've ever dreamt and longed to do and everything that I've ever said that I would do for you is bound up in that son, and I want you to kill him. The interesting thing for us 21st century Worthingers, moderns, is that we're shocked by the fact that God asks for a child sacrifice, but Abraham isn't shocked by that at all. Abraham is far more shocked in the story, the fact that God says, I don't want you to sacrifice your son in the end, and here's a ram as a substitute to sacrifice on behalf of instead of your son. Abraham is far more shocked by that, whereas Abraham isn't actually, he might be very sad and heartbroken, But he's not shocked that a God would require the sacrifice of his child. In fact, Abraham came from modern-day Iraq. He was a worshipper of all sorts of gods. He would have been very used to the concept of offering children as sacrifices. It's worth remembering that. And worshipping the God of freedom and ordering society around him must result in the protection of life. We saw that last week, we won't go over it, but God is a God who loves life. He's the God of life. Animals, humans, the planet, etc. And so a priestly vision of society, which is what we're talking about with Leviticus, always must lead itself towards a valuing, a sacredness of life, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable. Right? And we've seen in previous episodes a kind of barometer of the health of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable people. And a society that's ordered around the God of freedom will intrinsically and should intrinsically look to care for the most vulnerable. And just to say, we still do this today. See, we like to think we've moved way beyond Leviticus. Actually, I think we've not moved close enough to it. We still do this today. 200,000 babies are killed every year in the womb. A woman's womb is statistically the most unsafe place for a human being to be. More humans die from abortion every year than die from any other cause in the UK, hands down, even the coronavirus. It's the most life-threatening place to be in the UK, and it's become such a normal part of our culture. This is what I mean, right? The world has found its place in us. It's hard even to talk about, because it's so culturally unacceptable to talk about it, but we must talk about it. It's the biggest injustice, and I say that in light of everything that's happening at the moment with George Floyd and the kind of Black Lives Matter movement, and the kind of the highlighting of racism, particularly in the US, but equally so in our society. And we must hate that. We'll come to some stuff like that in a moment, but we mustn't forget. We mustn't say things like, we must never stay silent on issues of injustice without then talking about issues of abortion. Because not only is it, I think, the biggest injustice of our day, simply just say that because of the amount of death, like literally just statistically the biggest. I'm not even making a value judgment on whether it's worse than racism or not at all. Although I think there's a case to be made for that. I'm just talking about numbers. Not only is it the biggest injustice, but it's also the least talked about. It's the least culturally acceptable to talk about. And I'm just concerned, whilst I think we absolutely must respond to racism, we must call it out, we must teach into it, we must learn, we must self-reflect. I've said all of these things now in a few places. I think we must also be willing to talk about the things that our culture doesn't want to talk about. Otherwise, I think in the end we're doing substantial virtue signalling. By that I mean virtue signalling is just like, you stick on something on social media and it kind of just shows your virtue without you actually having to do anything. I think in the end what we end up is doing substantial virtual signalling, which is virtual signalling with a shed load of content. Maybe good content, that we need to talk about this, we need to learn about this, we need to self-reflect, we need to teach into this. Yes, we should do all of that. And we will do all of that as Redeemer in the coming months. But we must not neglect this issue in the midst of it. I think we call it healthcare, we call it freedom to choose as a society, but the God of freedom would call this a form of slavery, not freedom. When a society ends up killing its most vulnerable, the Lord, the God who needs no one but sides with the oppressed, the God of freedom would never call that a form of freedom. He'd never call that a form of healthy choice. He'd never call that a form of healthcare. And I just want to be really honest about that. And true freedom, there are restrictions with true freedom. Don't kill the most vulnerable in your society is a restriction. It is a restriction. But true freedom is not the absence of restrictions. It's the embracing of the right restrictions to enable you to flourish. Really important. We might come to that a little later. And we would do better to see abortion as a modern form of child sacrifice as Christians. That everything we do is linked to what we love and what we worship. And it might not be to Molech that we kill our kids. In fact, of course it's not, right? Most of us have never even heard of Molech. He's a god of the ancient Near East, right? Probably not worshipped at all anymore. And yet, if I can say the spirit of Molech is not a god. There's only one God. But the Bible is very clear that every worship of something that's not a god is it actually has an evil spirit. It's like a demonic thing. It's something. It has something behind it, right? The false god of Molech might just be a statue in the ancient world, right? It's nothing. But behind it is an evil power drawing us to worship false gods, which is actually the very evil power that Jesus defeated on the cross. So when it says in Colossians 2:15 that he disarmed the rulers and authorities by triumphing over them in him, he's talking about that the evil power behind idols God has destroyed, so that we can be free of the idol and the bigger evil power behind. And so I think we'd better see child sacrifices, abortion as a modern form of child sacrifice. And although it's not Molech that we sacrifice to, it may well be for other false gods, like lifestyle, like career, like reputation, or unwillingness to take responsibility for decisions. These are some of the main reasons that abortions happen in our nation. So we're sacrificing to these gods of, I don't want to appear in the wrong way, I don't want to hinder my career, I don't want to take a dent to my finances or my lifestyle, I don't want to take responsibility for the decisions that I've made. Sacrifice to those gods. Just to say as well, just a kind of pastoral word into this, that a fraction of abortions in the UK are for genuine health reasons, right? So where the life of the child or the mother is at risk, and I just want to say that I don't even pretend to know what that's like to be in that situation. I've never been in that situation, and even if I was, I think it's far more acute for the woman in that situation who, if anyone's life is going to be at risk other than the babies, it's going to be the mothers. And so just to say, I have absolutely no idea what that would be like. And these things are far more complex. Sorry, these are very complex and tough and painful decisions for a family to take. However, I just think if we consider an unborn child to be, if we consider an unborn child to be a child nonetheless, in the end, our decisions should always be to protect life. And so you might ask, well, what about whose life therefore comes first, right? If it's one or the other, which can happen in some situations. I think that's unbelievably difficult. I'd just say, I think my judgment on it is, and this isn't taken directly from Scripture, but I'm trying to be shaped by it. I think my stance on it would be that it would always be better to trust your life or the life of your baby with the Lord than to intentionally end the life of a child to save your own, if that makes sense. So I think a biblical, godly response would be, this is the most scary thing that we've ever had to deal with, but I'm going to trust the life of myself and my baby with God, rather than take that judgment myself. I also would just want to say that I think a parent's job is to show your children what God is like. And this would be unbelievably, I can't even imagine how tough this would be, but even to the extent, if that meant that you never met your child, if it was you or the baby, I think what a painful thought, but what a also precious, unbelievably precious way to show your child what God is like than to give your life for them. I think, there's no other way that you could communicate how much you love your child and how much what God is like than that. I think God is someone who gives up his life for us, and I want to throw those things in there, but very difficult and complex. Verse 22. Homosexual sex is another really kind of tricky one in our culture. Man, who thought this? We've been in this now for like 35 minutes. There's so much to say about some of this stuff. Verse 22, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination, which is a very, very strong word, particularly for our culture. It's worth bearing in mind that lots of things are called abominations in Leviticus, some other sexual practices, but also worshipping other gods. So it's just worth bearing that in mind. That doesn't lessen the strength of the word. It just shows you that God has strong feelings about a number of practices. It's really important to note that, like I said earlier, these passages have been used out of context to bash gay people, and that is completely contrary to the tone and the point of this passage. And when we come to chapter 19, it's worth knowing that this one command about sex between two men is set within a whole load of other sexual commands, right? Let's never elevate this one command over others. The Christians have done that so often. The church has done that so often, and I think that in and of itself is abhorrent to God, and we think this is the sin. Whereas, one of the most watched categories on a pornography website called Pornhub, I read the other day, is like stepdaughter, like mother and stepdaughter, or mother and stepson, right? Having sex together on camera. And no doubt the majority of that is played by actors, but it's just the concept that we're kind of elevating and celebrating through a porn culture, and that is equally kind of said, do not do that in Leviticus, and yet we don't find many people talking about that. We don't find many people decrying that practice in that section of pornography, say. But I just think it's really important that we don't put one thing over against another, and Christians have been really poor at that, and I think that does us no favours, or anyone any favours. It's often argued that this refers to some kind of non-consensual sex, so like slavery, prostitution, even cult worship, but is not referring to like two people who have committed themselves together in a loving relationship and therefore having sex. I think that's a good argument. I don't think it's convincing from the text. I think there's no such indication in the text whatsoever. It just says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman, right? So, and actually when you come to chapter 20 and there's a similar phrase, it's quite clear that it's some kind of consensual thing. It's not just like an abuse or rape or anything like that. So I think there's just no indication there. And it's often argued that we don't obey a shed load of other stuff in Leviticus, like we still eat shellfish, we don't sacrifice this animal and that animal, we sow different types of seeds together, we weave different types of fabric together. These jeans are two types of different like of fabric. So why are we saying we should obey this one to do with homosexual sex and not a shed load of other things? A couple of things to say on that. The context is sexual practice, and just to say that if you read through that passage again, as a culture, I'm not saying that no one does these things in our culture, obviously, but as a culture, we by and large line up with the sexual prohibitions in Leviticus. We say, yes, you should not have sex with your mum. Yes, you should not have sex with your sister. Yes, you should not have sex with your granddaughter. We buy into those, and yes, a woman should, as a culture by and large, should not have sex with an animal. Yes. So the majority of them we buy into anyway. So it's not like there's a shed load of stuff that we think, oh, that's all a load of nonsense. It's actually, there's almost like one thing in the midst of a shed load of things that we actually agree with and affirm, which I think is just an interesting point to note. The New Testament is worth saying. So I think a Christian's application of Leviticus, like I said, we can make a big mistake with this, and we can think we don't have to do Leviticus anymore because of Jesus. But that's not the way the Bible talks about it. The Bible says that Jesus came to bring to its completion, to its goal, the law, including Leviticus, so that we, when we get placed in Jesus and then subsequently filled with the Holy Spirit, start to live almost on a different plane. It's not that God has brought his kind of standards of what it means to be human down to our level. It's like he's elevated us by the Spirit to enable us to fulfill the righteous requirements of the law, in the language of Romans 8:3. And so we still fulfill the law. In fact, Paul says in Galatians 5, I think it is, in this command fulfill the law, and he goes straight to Leviticus 19. So we do fulfill the law in that sense. And so we're always asking the question, not what parts of this do I need to do and not do, but we're asking a better question, which is, how do I fulfill this command, this verse, through the lens of Jesus by the Spirit. Because it's like Jesus has brought us to the final part of the story of humanity in the world, which is that he's bringing about a new creation. And so the job of the Christian is to figure out, how do I live in this new creation? How do I live in a new creational way in the middle still of the old creation? And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 that the form of this world, the current form of this world, is passing away. It's like the old world around us is slowly decaying, soon to pass away, but the new creation that has been started at the resurrection of Jesus will stand forever. And so we've got to start to learn to live in the new creation, not in the old creation which is still around us, by the Spirit. And so I'm saying all of that because that matters about how we apply these things. Don't say, oh, that's not for today. Thank goodness for Jesus. There'll be Christians who will think that it's completely legitimate for a man to have sex with a man in a committed, loving relationship, because what does Leviticus matter anyway? Jesus was, came to show us the way of love, and we've progressed beyond that into a kind of new sexual ethics. You hear all these kind of arguments, but I think that's a misapplication of how to read the Bible. We do fulfill the Leviticus, we do fulfill the principles of Leviticus, we just do it through the lens of Jesus by the Spirit. And I think it's very telling when in the New Testament, post Jesus, post the giving of the Spirit, post the launching of new creation, when the New Testament writers still say, and men should not be having sex with men, and women should not be having sex with women. I think when that's still being said in a new creation with the Spirit, we've really got to take big note there. And when Paul talks about this in 1 Timothy 1 or 1 Corinthians 6, Romans 1, there's some other places, he actually uses the language of Leviticus 18. He coins a new word, right, that's only ever used subsequent in the Greek language after Paul uses it. So scholars think he created this word, and he created it from a translation of this word, man lie with a man, male, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. Paul creates a new word out of that phrase, and another phrase like it in Leviticus 20. And so Paul is a faithful Jew. He has a Jewish worldview that there's one God, and that one God wants to one day unite heaven and earth, and he started that through this people with this tent. And the way that we use our sex lives kind of embody what this one God wants to do by uniting heaven and earth together in one place. Paul is very switched on to that worldview, and so he's embedded in there. And so even when he writes, thousands of years later, he's writing with this kind of stuff in mind. And I just suggest that, given the point of sex is to procreate and in some way to be a precursor to the coming together of God and humanity, heaven and earth, two distinct things that complement each other, right? God and humanity, distinct things that God created humans to complement God, to come together with God, to, like heaven and earth, two distinct things, but actually they belong together in a wonderful union. In Ephesians 5, where Paul talks about the uniting of Jesus and the church, it's like man and his wife, these two things coming together. That sex is like that. Sex is something about so much more profound than just the moment of sex, even just than sex within marriage. It's more than that. It's about what God is doing in the world. And so if you mess with it, you're messing with a key way that you can show this world what is actually going on, that God wants to unite heaven and earth in Jesus. And so it's this massive thing. And given all of that, and given the clear sexual teaching of the New Testament, I'd say that this command not only still applies, but applies to us in this way. When we read it through a Jesus lens, a new creation lens, when we are filled with the Spirit, I think we still apply it in the same way. And so for followers of Jesus who are kind of have a sexual orientation towards the same sex, I think this is such a difficult one to grapple with, especially, it always has been, but especially in a culture which so affirms that you should be able to be in a committed relationship with whoever you flipping well want. And I think our culture really affirms that, and it's kind of knitted into us. And so I think this is such a difficult one to grapple. If that's you and you're same-sex attracted and a follower of Jesus, I really feel for you. I think this is a tough one to live with. Just to say that I think a couple of things. I think every single Christian, Jesus calls to leave everything, die to ourselves and follow him. And those of us that are heterosexual Christians have not demonstrated that enough, have not lived that out enough to show homosexual Christians what that's like. We've not counted the cost of what it means to follow Jesus. We have a very low bar, I think, in the Western world of what it means to follow Jesus. And so when we say things to people of same-sex attraction, actually, you know what, you shouldn't be in a relationship with someone of the same sex. You should abstain from that. It sounds like we're placing the bar right up here of what it means to be a follower of Jesus when our bar is way down here. I think another thing we've not done well is we've not talked at length about the value and the glory of singleness. It's really, not appreciated in our culture and not appreciated by Christians. I think we need to change that. Paul had a very high view of singleness and the importance of it and the effectiveness of it and the gift that it is. Just to say, like, if you're single now, it's not when we say, like, the gift of singleness. Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 7. We're not saying that you've got a special ability to endure singleness or like that you love singleness any more that we say someone with the gift of marriage has a special gift to love or endure or enjoy marriage. It's just that that's the situation you're in and that's your gift, right? Your current situation is your gift. If you're single now, that it's the gift that you've been given, a gift by God to use for his glory and your good. If you're married now, you've been given a gift by God to use for his glory and your good. But we should have a much higher view of singleness. And just to say that for heterosexual and homosexual people, sexual desire will ultimately only be fulfilled when we see Jesus face to face, which sounds like a very weird thing to say, I appreciate. But sexual desire, whether you fulfill it or not, in that sense, in this temporary world, it's always going to be unfulfilled in the sense that it was designed to show you that you were made for more, that you were made for someone else. And so being abstinent as a same-sex attracted Christian or a heterosexual Christian, it's like the desires that you have sexually and for companionship, even for deep intimacy, will only be fulfilled in every single one of us when we meet Jesus face to face. Really important to bear in mind. But when it comes to singleness, like I said, we've got to provide the church has got to be a family, right? It's no good like us all being in our kind of nuclear family units and saying to those who are same-sex attracted, oh, you kind of got to be abstinent for Jesus, bear your cross, die to that desire in yourself and live a single life, but see you because I'm just going home with my wife and my kids now. We've got no time for you. That's not good enough, right? We've got to be this bigger family of God where we say, yes, this is what it's going to mean for you to follow Jesus, and there's going to be pain and joy in the journey, on the journey. But we're going to walk that journey with you. You come live with us. You come into our family. Our door's open any time. I don't care if it's day or night. If you want to sleep on the sofa, the spare room, you want to move in with us. We're family together. We're brothers and sisters in Jesus. We've got to have that kind of view if we're going to help same-sex attracted Christians to flourish. We are not going to get to chapter 19 and 20. I cannot believe it. We're adding episodes here. I'm sorry about that. But I just find this so important to grapple with. Let's just finish with the last part of chapter 18, verses 24 to 30. Let's just read it. Do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations that I am driving out before you have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes and my rules, and do none of these abominations, neither the native or the stranger who travels among you. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean. Lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For everyone who does any of these abominations, the persons who do them shall be cut off from among their people. So keep my charge, never to practice any of these abominable customs that were practiced before you, and never make yourselves unclean by them. I am the Lord your God. So we end that chapter with the rhythm, the beat. I'm the God of freedom. I'm the God of freedom. I want you to be free. I want you to be like me. I want you to order society around me. Notice in those verses the anthropomorphism of the land. That's a big word. The anthropomorphism. The land is given a sense of humanness, a sense of personality. The land will vomit you out. God does say in that, I'm driving out, but he says the land will respond. If you order your life, order your society around other gods in other ways, it won't just be me that kicks you out. It's like the land itself just can't deal with you because of how unclean you've made it. And it's just an interesting thing. If Leviticus was finally edited and compiled when Israel went exile for not living up to the vision of Leviticus, which I think it probably was, this would have been an especially powerful and emotive thought. We didn't order ourselves around the God of freedom, so the land kicked us out. Just imagine you're in exile looking back, thinking, what did we do wrong? Where did we go wrong? And you read something like this in Leviticus. And God's saying, if you don't order yourselves around me, the land will kick you out. And you think, yeah, we didn't order ourselves around the God of freedom. We fell so far short of this vision. And in the end, Israel gets portrayed as a new Egypt. They end up worshipping other gods and end up building the temple to the God of freedom on the backs of slaves under the reign of King Solomon. And they lose sight of their God-given calling to be the priests of the nations and become insular and nationalistic, which really comes through in all sorts of places in the Old Testament, particularly in stories like Jonah, but also when Jesus comes, this big criticism of the temple, this what should be the epicenter of the God of freedom, actually becomes this place of nationalism and greed and introspection. They've completely lost sight of their call to be the priests of the nations. And what does that tell us? It tells us that regret is really powerful. Looking back at while they were in exile, but no, even when you're looking back at where you've gone wrong, there's always a way back with this God. Every time that God talks about putting his people into exile, he says, but when you turn to me, I'll turn to you. I'll bring you back from the nations. I'll gather you back in. It's this beautiful promise of constantly starting again with this God, a God who resets, who restarts, who sends the goat into the wilderness to where you watch your junk go away. This God always does that. Even another thing we can see is even God's people can lose their way and become like the neighbours. Check that within yourself. Even us, even Redeemer, even churches in Worthing, even the church in the UK, the church in the nations can become like the cultures we were called to be distinct from so that we could bring God to. Like C.S. Lewis said, we thought we were just finding our place in the world, but the world was finding its place in us. Friends, we've got to check that in ourselves, especially when it comes to issues of justice, sexuality, abortion being a big one. God's judgments are gracious and he wants a pure people. So even when God talks about driving the nations out of the land by the people of Israel, it's in view that the people of Israel are then going to become a light to the nations. They're then going to become the priests of the people that have been driven out. Right? And even when the people of Israel are driven out, he does that with a purpose later on of bringing them back and restoring them ultimately through Jesus. And just lastly to say, creation itself responds to a broken society. When we order our society around the gods, not the God of freedom, creation itself will groan. Creation itself will respond. And this is more relevant than ever to us, I think, with stuff like climate change and the way that we've ordered, the way that we've built, the way that we've kind of orchestrated things in our society, our economics, our output, our consumerism. All of these things have huge impacts. The way that we eat meat, the clothes that we wear, the way that we produce different things. The creation, in some sense, is still vomiting people out. It's still kicking back against the way that we order our society. Don't confuse, like, okay, there's environmental issues, and then there's religious issues, and then there's ethical issues. No. They're all bound together. The gods that we worship, what flows out of that is the way that we order our society, particularly in terms of our morality, and the creation responds, all bound together. Think of the coronavirus like stemming from wet markets in China, just as an example. The land needs rest. Have you loved chapter 18? I hope so. So much in there, and I thought we were going to do 18 to 20 today, but I was incredibly wrong. So we're going to do hopefully 19 and 20 next week, and I will see you then. Have a fantastic week. Look forward to seeing you on Sunday for Redeemer Kids 9:30, then Redeemer Online at 10. And we're going to be continuing our series in the Pioneers, almost at the end of that now. I hope you're enjoying that, and we'll see you soon. See you next week. Bye.